Imagine you're someone deeply rational and pragmatic, forced to believe in something you can't prove logically. Now imagine the one forcing you is an entity that recreated your entire life, placed you in a new body, in a new world, and keeps throwing you into the most extreme situations, all just to make you finally give up and say, I believe. That's exactly what happened to Tanya Degurechaff. But this isn't just a story about a girl and her god. It's something more than that. This is a story about two egos equally stubborn, and one of them just happens to be stuck in the body of a 10-year-old. I'm going to take you into this ideological war from the very beginning all the way to the deepest question of all. Who is really in control here? Let's get to know the two sides who fighting it, because no matter how big the conflict is, it doesn't mean anything if we don't truly understand who's facing off. The first side is a Japanese man, a salaryman who is intensely rational, intensely pragmatic, and atheist. He's not evil in any conventional sense. He's just someone who believes fully in logic, efficiency, and results. Until one day, he fired an employee without a shred of guilt, and that employee retaliates by pushing him into the path of an oncoming train. At the moment of his death, he encounters the second side, an entity that calls itself X. This entity claims to be God, not tied to any single religion, but more like a supreme force governing multiple worlds at once. X offers him something simple: acknowledge my existence and you'll get a new peaceful life. But the man refuses. Calmly, with total conviction, he says there must be a logical explanation for all of this, and that he doesn't need faith to live a good life. X, whose ego is just as massive as its claimed power, is offended by this refusal. So as punishment, or perhaps more accurately as a challenge, X sends him into a new world resembling early 20th century Europe in the body of an orphaned girl named Tanya Degurechaff. The condition is simple: life in this world will be filled with extreme hardship, and the only way out is to find faith. The problem is, X may have miscalculated. X wasn't punishing someone who would submit. X had just created an opponent who would fight back to the very end. Here's where the uniqueness of this conflict really shows. This isn't a war of weapons or territory. It's a purely ideological war, and the battlefield is belief itself. Tanya, who retains the personality and mindset of her adult self, approaches this situation with total pragmatism. For her, acknowledging X as God is the same as surrendering her own autonomy of thought. She doesn't see this as a spiritual matter. She sees it as a question of who holds control over her own life. And above everything else, Tanya is a character obsessed with control and self-preservation. So her strategy becomes clear. She will never openly worship X, but she's also not foolish enough to openly defy him either. She plays in the narrow gap between the two, performing small rituals that look like reverence, while inwardly remaining convinced that all of it is just coincidence and cause and effect. On the other side, Being X has its own problem. As an entity claiming to be God, its existence depends on recognition. Every time Tanya survives an impossible situation without truly surrendering to faith, it's not just a minor setback, it's a threat to the very foundation of what makes Being X matter as God. So this is the root of the war. Tanya fights to preserve her rationality and control over her own fate. X fights to preserve its existence as something that must be acknowledged. Two existential needs that simply cannot coexist. This conflict doesn't play out through long dialogues or direct confrontations. Being X rarely appears in physical form. He fights in a far subtler way, and that's exactly what makes it feel real. Every time Tanya starts to feel comfortable, every time she finds a safe path to a quiet life, X seems to intervene and throw her right back into a life or death situation. The clearest example is when Tanya deliberately chooses a military path as an administrative staff officer, a choice she calculates as the safest route, far from the front lines. But because of X's interference, her extraordinary abilities end up pulling her into an elite combat unit, straight into the heart of the most brutal warfare. The irony here feels deliberate. The harder Tanya tries to avoid situations that would force her to need a miracle, the more often she gets thrown into situations that are statistically impossible to win. And every time she wins, she credits it to her own cunning and instincts, never to prayer. Tanya herself knows exactly what's happening. She's aware she's being tested, and she deliberately plays right on the edge, performing just enough religious gestures to avoid provoking X's wrath further, but never enough to count as full acknowledgement. This is no longer just a story about surviving a world war. It's a two-way psychological gamble, where one side refuses to admit defeat, and the other refuses to stop pushing. At this point, we can start asking something bigger than just who's winning. The real question is, how much of Tanya's success is actually the result of her own doing? Tanya fully believes that everything she's achieved comes from her own intelligence, strategy, and instincts. But if we step back for a moment, there's a troubling possibility. What if the extraordinary abilities she possesses, the luck that keeps saving her at the last second, are actually tools deliberately given to her by X, precisely so that Tanya keeps surviving and keeps being forced into the next extreme situation? If that's true, then the irony runs even deeper. Tanya thinks she's fighting X by holding on to her rationality, but it's possible she's actually moving exactly along the path X wants, just through a far more complicated route than simply praying and believing. This is where the real philosophical question of Youjo Senki emerges. Is free will actually real, or is it just an illusion that feels real for as long as we don't know who's pulling the strings behind the stage? Tanya is convinced she's in control of her own destiny, but we, as the audience, can see something bigger from the outside, that perhaps she's just playing on a chessboard whose rules she's never fully understood. So if we bring all of this together, the ideological war between Tanya and Being X was never about who's stronger, but about who's willing to give up first. And so far, both of them are equally stubborn. Tanya holds her ground by refusing to believe, but has to keep paying the price with a life constantly on the edge of destruction. Being X holds his ground by continuing to press her, but every time Tanya fails to surrender, it becomes a small threat to his own existence as God. So what do you think? Did Tanya really win through her own rationality, or is she actually just a pawn, unknowingly being played by a force far greater than herself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective on this. And if you enjoyed this kind of discussion, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more anime analysis. See you in the next video. Thanks!